The morning Audrey Callum decided to sell her father's Purple Heart, she had exactly $847.13 in her checking account 9 days before rent was due, and a box of instant ramen on the counter she'd been stretching across 6 days. She sat at the kitchen table in her Kettering apartment and didn't cry. She'd already done that. 3 weeks ago when the termination letter arrived, 2 weeks ago when she filed her appeal and got the standard response, last Thursday when she called her mother in Dayton and had to pretend everything was manageable because her mother was 61 and living on $1, $300 a month, and there was absolutely nothing her mother could do. Audrey had said, "I'm figuring it out, Mom," and believed herself enough to get through the phone call. But this was a Tuesday. The rent was $1,150. Her car payment was $340, and it was 8 days past due. Student loans took $280 automatically on the 15th, and her bank account would overdraft if she didn't move money she didn't have. She'd applied to 4 other hospitals in the county, 2 urgent care chains, and a home health agency. She'd had 1 phone screen and a silence that felt permanent. The shadow box on her bedroom wall held 2 medals. Her father's, Staff Sergeant Raymond Callum, killed in action in Fallujah in 2004 when Audrey was 6 years old, recipient of the Purple Heart. And hers, an Army Commendation Medal from her 1 tour before she came home, went to nursing school on the GI Bill, and spent the next 8 years becoming the kind of ICU nurse that other nurses called when a patient's pressure was dropping and the attending was still 15 minutes out. She wrapped both medals in a dish towel, placed them in her tote bag next to her wallet with the $23 in cash she'd been conserving for gas, and drove to Belmont Pawn and Exchange on Far Hills Avenue. Her Honda Civic had 193,000 miles on it. She stopped for $10 of gas because the gauge was sitting just below the quarter mark and she didn't trust it on empty. That left her $13. She'd been fired from Mercy Regional Medical Center 6 weeks ago. The official reason, typed on hospital letterhead and signed by Human Resources Director Pamela, signed by the HR director, was conduct unbecoming a licensed professional and repeated failure to follow chain of command. What Audrey had actually done was file a formal report twice about the charge nurse on her floor, a man named Dr. Craig Pendleton, who carried the dual title of Clinical Operations Director and held informal power over nearly every scheduling decision for ICU nursing staff. She'd documented what she'd seen, a pattern of medication discrepancies. Fentanyl logged as administered to patients whose charts showed no corresponding pain assessment, vials accounted for at shift change that didn't match what she and her coworkers had drawn. She'd brought it first to her floor supervisor, then to the pharmacy director. Then she'd filed with the State Board of Nursing. 2 weeks later, she'd been placed on administrative suspension. 3 weeks after that, terminated. She'd told exactly 2 people what she'd found. One was her coworker, Rita Sosa, who'd seen enough herself to be scared and had 3 kids at home and stayed quiet. The other was a union rep who'd said, sympathetically, that her chances of reinstatement through internal grievance were, quote, not great given the documentation gap. The documentation gap, as if Audrey hadn't spent 4 months writing everything down in a spiral notebook she kept locked in her car. Belmont Pawn and Exchange opened at 9. Audrey got there at 9:20 and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. Inside, the owner, a man named Lou Barnett, 60-something, with reading glasses perched on his forehead and a Bengals mug steaming on the counter, greeted her the way pawn shop owners greet people who come in alone on Tuesday mornings, gently, without commentary. She unwrapped the dish towel and placed both medals on the glass counter. Lou set down his mug. He looked at them for a moment without touching them. "These yours," he said, "not accusatory, just careful. The commendation medal is. The Purple Heart was my father's." She kept her voice level. She'd practiced it in the car. "He died in 2004. I've had it since I was 12. Lou nodded slowly. He pulled the reading glasses down and looked more closely at the Purple Heart, at the purple fabric ribbon that had faded at the edges from where she'd touched it over the years. "I can do $280 for both," he said. "Commendation medals not as." The door opened. The dog came in first. It was a Belgian Malinois, lean and amber-colored, wearing a tactical vest with a patch that read "Retard Working Dog." It moved with the particular quiet of an animal that had been trained for years to enter spaces without disturbing them. Its handler followed, a man around 40, broad-shouldered, in a Montgomery County Fire Department jacket, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent time in the military and never fully stopped carrying it. "Hey, Lou," the man said. "Left my grandfather's watch here for the 90-day hold. Just coming to pick it up." "Jonah," Lou said. "Yeah, let me get in the back." But Brace had already stopped. The dog was 3 feet from the counter when something shifted in him. Audrey saw it happen. His nose working, his pace slowing, his whole body dropping an inch lower. He turned toward the counter. He walked to the glass case, placed both front paws on the edge, and looked directly at the Purple Heart. Then he made a sound, low, not a growl, not a bark, something between a whimper and a held breath. He set his chin on the glass beside the metal and did not move. "Brace." The man Jonah Wexler, his name sewn on the jacket, stepped forward. "Brace off." The dog didn't lift his head. Jonah looked at the medals on the counter and then at Audrey. Something changed in his expression. "I'm sorry," he said. "He doesn't usually." He stopped. He was looking at the Purple Heart the way Lou had looked at it, carefully. "Is that a Purple Heart?" "Yes." "And an Army commendation?" He pointed at the second medal, not touching. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Brace still hadn't moved. The dog's eyes were half closed, his chin pressed to the glass, breathing slowly. "Were you Army?" Jonah asked. Audrey had not planned to talk to anyone in this store for more than 4 minutes. She had planned to take the $280 and put $200 toward rent and use the other $80 for groceries and figure out the rest in 2 weeks. But there was something in the way this man asked the question. Not curious, exactly. More like he already understood what it meant that she was here, and he needed to confirm it before he could do anything else. "1 tour," she said, 266th Medical Company. "I got out and went to nursing school." Jonah Wexler looked at the Purple Heart again. "That was your father's?" "Yes." He put his hand on Brace's back. The dog leaned into it but still didn't move from the counter. "What happened?" he asked. She almost said nothing. She almost said, "It doesn't matter," or "I just need the money," or any of the half-dozen exit lines she'd prepared. But she was 32 years old, and she'd been awake since 4 in the morning, and she'd spent 6 weeks doing everything the right way: the complaint forms, the union rep, the appeal letter, the job applications, and none of it had done anything except drain what remained of her savings account down to $847.13. "So," she told him. Jonah Wexler listened the way she'd learned to listen to patients' families, completely, without filling the silence. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. First, did she have documentation? She told him about the spiral notebook in her car, the photographs she'd taken of the discrepancy logs on her phone before the hospital locked her out of the system, and the flash drive she'd put in a storage unit on Wilmington Pike 6 weeks ago. $45 a month, which she'd barely made last month by selling 3 nursing textbooks on eBay for $67. Second, had she filed with the Ohio Board of Pharmacy, not just nursing? She had not. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Lou came back from the storeroom with a small paper bag, the watch, and set it on the counter and, with the particular tact of a man who'd seen a lot of Tuesday mornings, quietly went to the back again. "I know someone at the AG's office," Jonah said. "Former Army. JAG officer went civilian after his second tour. He handles healthcare fraud specifically." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. "I'm not going to tell you this fixes everything. I don't know what you have or whether it's enough. But if what you're describing is real, and I believe you, someone needs to see that flash drive." Audrey looked at her father's Purple Heart still sitting on the glass counter, with a Belgian Malinois chin resting 2 inches away from it. "Why does your dog do that?" she said. Not quite a question. Jonah scratched Brace gently behind the ear. The dog's tail moved once. "He was a casualty search dog overseas," he said. "He was trained to locate wounded soldiers. When he was working, he could find someone alive under 6 feet of rubble." He paused. "I think he smells the history on them. I don't know. I've had him 7 years, and he's never done that with anything except..." He stopped and started again. "Except things that mattered." Audrey picked up her father's Purple Heart and wrapped it back in the dish towel. She put both medals in her tote bag. Lou Barnett didn't say a word about it. The flash drive had 31 files on it, photographs of medication logs, typed summaries of dates, times, patient identifiers, discrepancy amounts. A document Audrey had put together. After the second time, she'd reported internally, formatted like an incident report, because she'd worked in a hospital long enough to know that how something was written determined whether anyone read it. The man from the AG's office, his name was Lawrence Chu, and he'd done 2 tours with the 82nd Airborne before going to law school, read through the file twice during the call and asked her to come in that Thursday. She drove to Columbus on a tank of gas she put on a credit card she'd been trying not to use. Lawrence Chu and 2 colleagues spent 4 hours with her, the spiral notebook, the photographs, the formal complaint she'd filed with the Ohio Board of Nursing, which it turned out had been received and assigned a case number and then sat in a queue for 11 weeks without action. Standard backlog, she was told, which was true. But there was also a note in the file from a hospital attorney that Lawrence Chu read twice with an expression that did not change, but somehow became very still. The investigation moved faster than Audrey had been told investigations moved. What they found: through the pharmacy records they subpoenaed, the hospital's internal communications, and the testimony of 2 other nurses who had filed informal concerns that had been quietly disposed of, was that Craig Pendleton had been diverting controlled substances for approximately 22 months. Fentanyl, primarily. The total volume was significant enough to trigger federal charges. The hospital's human resources director had received a written complaint from another nurse 14 months earlier and had flagged it as unsubstantiated after a 2-week internal review conducted by a committee that included, among others, Craig Pendleton. Audrey had not been the first. She had been the loudest, which was why she'd been the one terminated. Craig Pendleton was arrested on a Friday morning, 6 weeks after Audrey Callum sat across from Lawrence Chu in Columbus. The charges were federal: diversion of controlled substances, healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records. His nursing and clinical director credentials were suspended by the state board within the same week. The hospital issued a statement about their commitment to patient safety and the integrity of their clinical operations. Lawrence Chu, in a separate statement, called the conduct a systemic failure enabled by deliberate institutional suppression of legitimate safety concerns. Audrey was reinstated to her position in the Mercy Regional ICU on a Monday morning. Back pay came through 3 weeks later, $23,400, covering the 6 months she'd been out. It was the largest single deposit she'd ever seen in her checking account, and she sat in her car in the parking lot of her bank and did not cry, and then cried anyway for about 4 minutes, and then drove to the grocery store and bought real food for the first time since October. Rita Sosa hugged her in the break room on her first day back, hard, without saying anything. There was a formal letter of commendation from the Ohio Department of Health. There was a call from a patient advocate organization in Columbus that wanted to talk to her about testifying before the state legislature. There was a lot. But first, that Tuesday morning, she drove to Belmont Pawn and Exchange on Far Hills Avenue and went inside. Lou Barnett was behind the counter with his Bengals mug. He reached under the counter before she said a word and placed the dish towel in front of her. Both medals, still wrapped, still inside. She looked at him. "Figured you might be back," Lou said. He picked up his mug. "How about that?" Jonah Wexler brought Brace to the hospital 3 months later. During a community health fair, the hospital organized in something that felt like an apology dressed as goodwill. The dog moved through the corridor the way he always did, quiet, unhurried, aware of everything. He found Audrey in the hallway outside the ICU entrance. Brace went to her and pressed his head against her hip, and she put her hand on the back of his neck without thinking, the way you do with something you've known longer than you actually have. "How's the floor?" Jonah asked. "Busy," she said. "Always busy." She meant it without complaint. Jonah nodded. He had a way of nodding that meant he understood the weight of a thing without needing to discuss the weight of it. "Thanks," she said, "for the Tuesday." "You did the actual work," he said. "You kept the notebook. You kept the flash drive. You showed up in Columbus. He reached down and scratched Breas behind the ear. I just didn't make you sell the medals. That night, Audrey hung the shadow box back above her bed. Both medals were inside it. Her father's Purple Heart with its faded ribbon, her Army Commendation Medal with the gold seal. She'd had the glass replaced, and in the new light from the window, the ribbon's purple looked the way she remembered it from childhood, deep and specific and real. She stood there for a moment before she turned off the lamp. Her father had died doing the job he'd chosen, for reasons he'd believed in. She'd done the same, filed the report, kept the records, refused to let a good thing get buried under paperwork and institutional convenience. It had cost her 6 months and $847.13, and a lot of Tuesday mornings she'd never get back. It had not cost her the medals. That was enough to sleep on.